well. The weather's not quite so nice today. It's a little bit cold here in Yorkshire today. What's it like with you, Kevin?
It's sunny here.
Is it? Oh, you see. Sun always shines on the gust, doesn't it? And it's always sunny in Wales, I know.
Of course, yeah. I seem to recall hearing something about rain, but I've never understood what that is.
Okay, so we've got a slightly different day today because we've got Paul Howarth with us. So let me just click through the slides, just do the usual bit. So we've got Paul is with us today. He's going to be speaking about the Chancellor's, or giving us his views on the Chancellor's spring statement, what that all means for us. In addition, I've got the panel. Laura and Naomi aren't with us this week. They're both on holiday, but we've certainly got Kevin and Gareth. Hi, Kevin and Gareth.
Morning.
Morning.
And I don't know, is Liz on the call, Jake? Can you see?
Can't see Liz at the moment. No.
Okay.
No.
So Liz may join us a bit later. And we have Jake, who is marshalling. Hi, Jake.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so let's kick off because Paul's got quite a number of slides to go through. So I've only got one item on this one, which is Paul's session. So Paul, I'll hand over to you if you want to say next when you want me to move on to the next slide, and then we'll open it up for discussion at the end of Paul's presentation, if that's okay.
Okay, well, thank you, Malcolm, and welcome everybody. What I'd like to do is just zap through a few slides and talk about some of the implications of the spring statement. But looking first of all really at some of the cost of living issues in particular and giving it some context to start with, and try and go through this very quickly. If we go to the next slide, here are some headline figures largely taken from the Office of Budget Responsibility and the Resolution Foundation. But what you can see here is that inflation is forecast to be at a 40-year high of 8.7% in the fourth quarter of 2022 this year. So that is quite a dramatic statistic. And what that means for all of us really is that living standards as a whole are set to fall by 2.2% over the course of the next financial year. And this would be the largest financial year fall on record. And real wages are set to fall by 3% over the course of 2022. So some pretty dramatic figures there. Can I just illustrate those by with a few graphs? If we go on to the next slide, here we see the ONS information. Here we can see inflation since 2016. You can see that it's been steadily falling since about 2018, but now has jumped up. So the January figure was 5.5%. And of course, we now know the February figure, which is 6.2%, which is precisely double the figure used for the benefits at rating. And if you go on to the next slide, this shows the same information, but adds on a forecast. So just about everybody forecasting in the region of 8% for later this year. As we've seen, Office of Budget Responsibility saying 8.7%. So around 3 times the rate at which the benefits at rating is based on. So if we go to the next slide, just on the cost of on living standards, here you can see, we just look at the red bar right at the right-hand side, 2022-23. living standards as a whole, this is across the whole population, living standards fall by 2.2%, which, as you can see, I mean, this graph goes from 1956-57. So this is the sort of year-on-year increase normally in living standards. You can see that there's been a decrease in a few years, but in no year has it been as large as it is predicted to be next year. If we go on to the next slide, I mean, we've been talking in terms of general figures now, sort of overall figures for the economy as a whole and for the population as a whole. For low-income households, the situation I think is quite a lot worse. Basically, what we are looking at is because of the higher proportion of spending on energy and food, the inflation rate actually for low-income households will be more than the headline figures, probably around 10% according to the Resolution Foundation. And if you look at some comparisons so that you can sort of work out how that figure's been arrived at, what the Resolution Foundation is saying that in the year 2019-20, amongst households in the bottom 10th of incomes, 13.8% of spending was on food and non-alcoholic drink, compared to 8.5% for households in the top 10th. So in other words, it's clear that people on lower incomes are spending proportionately more of their income on basic essentials, and that goes through fuel and other things too. And as we've said, the benefits rise in April 22 is by 3.1%, because it's based on last September's inflation figure. So obviously much lower than forecasts for the year ahead. And of course, the temporary £20 uplift in universal credit was withdrawn in October 2021. So if we move on, what we have here is just illustrated a few statistics from a bit of research that the Money Advice Trust did. We could pick all sorts of things. Citizens Advice have done research. There's all sorts of figures out there about how low-income people are affected. But what this shows is that, for example, 12% of adults have sold items, and the same number have gone without food in the last 3 months because of the cost of living problems. And 15% think they will need to seek debt advice over the next 3 months. So I think the conclusion we can draw here is that potentially up to about a fifth of households are likely to really struggle. I mean, a lot of households will find it difficult, but people here will, about a fifth of households will find it particularly difficult and will almost certainly get into greater debt. So what is the government's response? I mean, I think first of all, if we can move to the next slide, I think it's important just to remind ourselves that there were some measures announced in February. These support specifically for rising energy costs. So there's the £200 discount, but essentially this is a loan. It will be recovered, added to the standing charge, we think, over the next 5 years. So it's rather like the universal credit advance. I mean, it's helpful to have the money, but it causes problems down the line. And then there's the £150 council tax rebate, which you will all know about very well. And that is for people liable for council tax in bands A to D, added to which we've got an extra 144 million for those who are not eligible for the council tax rebate. This is a progressive policy in the sense that this help is directed to people on low incomes. It's a flat rate, so it benefits those on the lowest incomes the most. £150, goes a long way for people on a low income. So that is helpful, but it is going to be offset by the real cut in benefits next year. And if we move on, we've then got the spring statement, and as you will well know, the Chancellor announced these measures. I won't go through them all, but the headline really is the increase in the threshold at which employees start to pay national insurance contributions. So that is very helpful for people on low income, worth £330 a year for actually 30 million people. But it is very helpful for those who will no longer pay it. There was the 5p litre reduction in fuel duty and VAT cuts on solar panels, etc. Plus our old friend, the Household Support Fund, another 500 million for this coming year. And that, as you know, is designed to help vulnerable people with food, clothing and other household bills, plus the income tax reduction later on. If we move on, I just want to say a little bit about the Household Support Fund. This is something which I would really welcome your views on, because I think it is particularly difficult to go about targeting this on vulnerable households, as the government is saying, when you've got so many people who are likely to be struggling. I've always said that there is a place for discretionary funds, and I think local authorities are the best place to administer them. But I think the problem we've got now is that this money will be needed by a lot of people, a lot more people than it could possibly be designed for. And I think, as well as that, I'd like to hear what you have to say about this, but it does seem to me that you haven't got all the tools that you need to find out, to determine really who needs support, and actually go out proactively to reach people rather than rely on applications. And I think my personal view is you need more data, particularly universal credit data, to do that. So if we move on to the overall impact, now we're talking now just for the moment just about the latest changes. As I say, I think the NI threshold changes are very welcome, but they only affect, of course, people in work. The key gainers from the whole package will be those who are earning between around 10,000 and 25,000. Those are the people who will be better off in the coming year. But of course, it doesn't help those who are already below the threshold, or indeed are not working at all. In terms of the spring statement measures themselves, the Resolution Foundation are saying that only £1 in every three will go to the bottom half of the income distribution, and that households in the top half gain more than the poorest fifth. So that, I think, largely is a result of factoring in the reduction in fuel duty. What Resolution Foundation are also saying is that overall, if we look at what's happening next in this next year, then a further 1.3 million people will fall into absolute poverty, including 500,000 children. And this is a massive change. And absolute poverty is usually defined as rather like relative poverty below 60% of median income, but absolute poverty takes that back to 2010-11. So you're talking about people who are below the poverty rate, increased, I think, by inflation, but below the 60% of median earnings as it was in 2010-11. So that's quite, quite appalling, really, to see that sort of figure, I think. Now, if we briefly look at alternative approaches, we can see that there were a whole lot of things suggested, many other things that could have been done, reducing VAT, increasing this energy bills rebate that has been paid, and so on. The Labour Party and the key opposition, I think, parties wanted a windfall tax on oil and gas producers, and there are arguments for and against that. I was a bit disappointed that in her statement in response to the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves didn't mention increasing benefits or universal credit as such. She did, of course, say that money would be spent on cuts in helping people on a low income, but didn't actually mention universal credit, which I think is a pity. Whereas the Times, amazingly to me, definitely did that. In fact, a couple of days before the statement, they talked about how the Chancellor should offer help to people, and basically said that there should be the Chancellor should be increasing universal credit by the expected rather than rate of inflation, rather than the figure that was used from September. So that, I would expect that from The Guardian maybe, but for the Times to come out with this sort of thing, and other bodies saying the same, I think it's fairly clear that there has been a missed opportunity here. So in conclusion, what I would say, if we go to the final slide, is that I think, first of all, the Chancellor, the government, has been too reliant on discretionary funds to help people who are struggling. As I say, I think there's a place for that, but there are just too many people struggling for that money to go around, and more needs to be done for those people on benefits. I don't think the measures were, some of them very welcome, some of them, pretty progressive in a sense, but really not sufficiently targeted those on the really low incomes of people who are not working or can't work, effectively receiving no help or extra help at all. And I think the Chancellor was sort of trying to act in a sort of political way to restore his tax cutting credentials after all the increases that he's made. I think that, that is promise of jam tomorrow. I don't know what, all sorts of things could happen before that. So, let's see. But, he essentially is presiding over the biggest tax hike in recent times, despite what he's announced. And I think that the upshot of all this and the reaction to the statement itself means that he could well be forced to do more later on, and there already seem to be some hints about this. So as the cost of living crisis unfolds, I think the government will be forced to do more. So that's my view, but obviously there are other views, and I'd really welcome taking part in a discussion, Malcolm, on this. Thanks.
Okay, yes, if anybody wants to join in, like Kevin, you can electronically raise your hand and we'll invite you in. Hang on for a second, Kevin. Or you can put stuff in the chat box. I also noticed Gareth to say something. So let's start with you, Kevin.
Thank you, Paul, for that. First question is, are we doomed? The second question I would like to ask, and you alluded to it, because the whispers coming out of sources from the government are stating things like the energy payments, the energy rebates, there's going to be a further one. And as Malcolm will recall, and a number of you will recall, I did forecast that 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I suspect there will be another one. The final point I'd like to make, over the last 2 years, and obviously, Paul, you've been on the fringes of it, we've never worked so hard in revs and benefits because most of the government schemes are thrown at us, and discretionary schemes often mean that there's further work because we need to get approval from our own local authorities on discretionary schemes, what we can do and what we can't do. We don't do the household support fund in my authority. It's done by housing. But there is arguments for linking it up. And the other thing is the Ukrainian crisis and the impact of that as well. I suspect that the Chancellor, and I welcome your views, will need to come back with further things.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I don't think we're doomed, but I think we are in a severe difficulty. I think the government's in a severe difficulty, given the scale of the cost of living issues that people are going to face. I mean, I've just touched on 1 or 2 bits from various bodies, but you could go virtually anywhere and find the same sort of story. We survived the pandemic just about, and I'm sure we'll come through all of this, but certainly I think you're absolutely right. If you predicted this a couple of weeks ago, I'm pretty sure that there will be further help offered. There will have to be, I think. It's just the current situation, I don't think is sustainable. And in terms of, revs and bends and operating these schemes, I mean, first of all, I do think the government needs to ensure that these are fully funded, that if the new burdens procedures work effectively here, because this further help will be, I'm pretty sure, down to local authorities to administer. But there is an opportunity, and I know that Team Netzel can offer help here if needed, and that is that I think all these funds can and perhaps should be administered together. So the household support fund, DHPs, all the rest of it. I think there's a big a good case really for looking across the piece at the kind of funding that is available and deciding what sort of support people need the most in individual circumstances.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Yeah, we can help. Obviously, our Get Help system does all of that. Gareth, let's come to you for your question.
Thanks, Paul. That was really interesting. I've got some kind of disjointed thoughts and points, I suppose, around the thing. One of the problems, I think, is that the government and everybody else is trapped by its own historical decisions to a certain extent in terms of how much it would have to change to have any real effect. So, I mean, in terms of inflation, you remember that we used to be an RPI-linked benefits increases rather than CPI many years ago. And of course, that would have increased the amount of money that people actually had to play with. CPIs, I think, 2% higher than RPI. Sorry, vice versa. RPI is 2% higher than CPI in the past month. So that would have made a big difference. Increasing benefits on their own wouldn't have a huge effect for many people without also, of course, changing the benefit cap completely. Because what's happened with increases in benefits, as we saw with the £20 UC and legacy benefits increase last year, was that it simply pushed a lot of people into the benefit cap area, so they never saw the benefit of it. And I think the other thing around kind of your point about integrating the different programs is that targeting really is very difficult. I mean, the very crude kind of band A to D targeting, for example, doesn't necessarily only get at poor people. If you look at band A to D houses in Westminster or Chelsea, you're probably going to find that most people in those don't really need that extra 150 bits. And the same thing is the moving the national insurance threshold forward in July. Great if you happen to be in work and paying national insurance, but of course if you're on means tested benefits, the only effect that that might have is to increase your net earnings and then see them reduced for HB and UC and everything else by the means test. As for the tax cut, well, you know, it might be a smear of jam, you know, the day after tomorrow, but I think the reality of that in terms of affecting anybody's behaviour or affecting things like the credit that anybody's going to be awarded is just really non-existent. So I'm struggling. I think everybody would like to do more. I just think it's really difficult to work out how to do that, even if the money is there. The constraints that have been put on kind of benefit delivery systems of all sorts, Rebs and Bens included, are really difficult ones to overcome in practice.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, with that, I mean, I think the Chancellor is trying to sort of address structural problems with the tax system, but I mean, Chancellor's been trying to do that for ages, and they are, you know, caught out. I mean, the Chancellor himself, really, I mean, whatever help he's offered is, you know, is dwarfed by the decision to freeze tax allowances and thresholds that take you into the 40% rate and all that. You know, because of inflation, ironically, he's gaining more from those changes than he would have done if inflation hadn't been so high. I agree about the benefit cap. I mean, all I would say is that yes, I mean, I certainly think the benefit cap should go, or certainly should be fundamentally changed, or at least uprated itself. I mean, the problem we have with some of these measures is that you know, those rates don't change, so the benefit cap stays at the amount it is now, where, you know, when benefits are increased, so more people are caught by it. That's exactly the same as the tax allowance problem. But you know, you can, I think, still increase benefits and help a substantial number of people who are not affected by the benefit cap. So I mean, I wouldn't not do it simply because of the benefit cap. I agree that targeting is inherently difficult, and that's why I think I would say that you know, you need more data to look at who it is, make some sort of assessment about who it is who is struggling and who is not. I mean, unfortunately, if you rely on applications, then you're relying on people knowing about these things and being informed. If people don't know what help, and often this is the case, they don't know what help is on offer and they don't apply, or they don't apply for other reasons. But if you actually can do some work to analyse the incomes of your residents and then invite applications to various things, then that is, you know, likely to have a better result.
Can I just pick up something on there, Paul? I mean, when you're saying that people don't know, I mean, I do think that's an issue. I mean, because take up benefit is still considerably too low, particularly you know, amongst pensioners as well. But I mean, we see from the statistics that come in on the BEX products that actually quite a lot of people do come in to inquire about what they can get, and I expect probably others on this call as well. Gareth, you will, through the ferret system. There is still quite a lot of inquiries, and particularly, I mean, I haven't checked this week's, but I would expect to see the numbers have gone up considerably for those that are making inquiries. The thing that really does for people is the point that Gareth makes is they get knocked out of the system very, very quickly, fail to qualify for a whole range of structural reasons within the system. I noticed the other day that food bank usage has gone up by about nearly 50% in the last 2 months. Yeah, so Gareth.
I was just going to say, I understand what you're saying, Malcolm, but I think if you look at the research, and I was looking at the take-up of pensioners research going back 10 years ago now, we know that owner-occupiers don't take up pension credit in over half the cases where the households are entitled to it. And when you look at the research that was done by DWP back in 2012, 60% of those people hadn't claimed the benefit because they didn't know about it or thought they weren't going to be entitled to it. And I think you traditionally have this problem, is that benefits are not for people like us. Yeah. Benefits are for really poor people, and we aren't really poor people. And once you have that kind of mindset, you're not going to inquire. You're going to make that assumption that you're out and it's not worth doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, Gareth. I'm not saying that people, the numbers inquiring are sufficient in numbers. But what I am saying is that I think certainly since 2012, since the introduction of universal credit, I think there is more inquiries. People are more aware, particularly as we've just gone through the pandemic, where the number of applications for universal credit rose quite considerably. What I'm saying is that even though I would agree that those that are making the inquiries, people still don't know, what I'm saying is even though that is still true, the amount of take-up has increased, but not necessarily the amount of applications, and some awareness has increased, but people are still not getting through. So that kind of reinforces that position that you're stating, that people come to the conclusions, if they get knocked back too quickly, that benefits are not for us, and so so that cycle is being perpetrated. Kevin, you wanted to say something?
Yes, thank you. Obviously, Paul, you used to be within the DWP, and I noticed that the discretionary housing payments budget has been considerably cut this year. So I think there is payback, there is additional funds, but there's an impact of the costs that have been funded by the government towards the pandemic. So they're probably managing the cost of living on the back of what has probably been unprecedented sums paid out to local businesses, local residents. For example, we've paid out nearly 100 million at Mid Sussex, and they've got to recoup it somehow. So how do you balance up the repaying of all the costs that have been done with trying to give people help in a situation at the moment? So you've probably got several factors into that consideration. In respect of forms, there is something called fraud, and people do commit fraud, and we've got to be careful that it's not over things aren't claimed that they shouldn't be claimed. And we've found that during COVID pretty much so. I think they found that with the increased number of UC claims that was done during that period. So I think there has to be a balance somewhere along the lines in respect of it. So, but I think we'll be paying for COVID for a number of years, and that probably gives the Chancellor a bit of a more difficult hand to play at this time.
Well, I don't know whether you want to come back on that. It sounded like you personally were going to be responsible there.
Yeah.
Well, I don't hold you personally responsible, Paul. I was just trying to make the point.
That's glad to know about that, Kevin.
I don't know. I hold it personally responsible.
But yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, the amount of debt, although sort of debt interest is now an increasing problem because of inflation. In other respects, the way in which debt and the state of the public finances sort of defined and organized, it means that the problems might be slightly easier than they would have been, but still there is a lot of issues that need to be resolved. But the key thing is there's choices, really, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that the Chancellor has decided is to freeze tax allowances as a contribution to that. But he could make other choices, and there's all sorts of other choices that he could, he could change the whole approach to this if he wanted to. And there are options like windfall taxes and so forth that could be helpful in that respect. So yeah, I mean, that is a constraint. I don't think discretionary housing payment budgets have been affected by that particularly because they're so marginal. But they are based on some sort of assessment about how the impact of welfare reforms will pan out. And whether that is an accurate way of doing it or a proper way of doing it now, I don't know, but that is how it's done, and so they must have forecast some reduction in the impact in order to reduce the budgets.
And presumably move money around as well, Paul, isn't it?
Pardon?
And to move money around, presumably. Yeah, to move it from one budget into another budget. Yeah,
potentially, but I mean it seems to me that sort of reinforces the case to administer these things together, so that you decide what kind of help a particular applicant needs and pay it from whatever funds seem most appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Sophia, you want to join in?
Hello, everyone. I have a couple of questions. Why can't Rishi Sunak set a lower levy minimum level for all the gas and electric that people are being charging? Apparently in France, where it's still in-house, they've set it to 4%. It seems that the biggest issue we have here is the gas and electric. I'm sure a lot of us will remember it's never been this high, certainly not in my lifetime. Even when we had the winter of discontent or the strikes and everything, gas and electric was never ever the extreme prices. And if it's going to hit nearly 3k come October, who's going to find this sort of money to pay that every month? It's more than your council tax. Also, going back to this issue with making applications, people not claiming because they assume that they won't qualify, with that mindset, maybe us as local government, even central government, need to change our messaging to get people to apply and see if they will qualify regardless. And it may increase take up. But do you feel that maybe government are reliant on a lot of people just being ignorant and thinking they won't qualify to claim? Because imagine if people did make all the claims that they were entitled to, how much would that truly cost?
Well, yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that is a very interesting point, because the estimates that departments have to make about expenditure do actually include certain assumptions about take up. The assumption is that take up of X benefit will be X percent, and that is sort of factored into the to the expenditure forecast. So that is an issue. At the same time, the government, in introducing universal credit, have combined 4 benefits and 2 tax credits together, and that in itself has increased take up, because it used to be the case people claimed income support, job seekers allowance, but failed to claim housing benefit or whatever. Now, if they claim universal credit, they claim universal credit, so they include all of that. So it's sort of mixed picture really on that. Yes, the government is mindful of the costs of take-up, but on the other hand, they can take and do take policy decisions which actually improve matters. On the levy, I mean, obviously in this country, it's the responsibility of Ofgem, the regulator, to look at that. But there are measures which, there are choices again that the Chancellor could make. I mean, if he'd wanted to, he could reduce VAT on fuel, which would make, quite a difference for everybody. I mean, it would be expensive because it would affect everybody. But that, there are things that could be done to reduce the impact of these, global price increases.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Sophia, or add to your?
I think she's mute.
Yes, she is. Yeah. Okay, Gareth, I think you wanted to add something to that, though, didn't you?
Not enormously. I think I've tried to understand the way in which energy pricing works, because, like a lot of people, do think, well, hang on, if I'm paying as I am my supplier who says it's entirely renewable sources and it's all wind and kind of solar, why have my prices gone up when the costs haven't gone up? And there is apparently some quite complicated formula where it's the extra amount that somebody has to pay for fuel once the normal supply has been used up, that gets then used to retrospectively set the pricing for everything, which puts everybody's price up to a maximum. So I'm sure that the Chancellor has got some scope to control that in some way. But I guess that there are political consequences to doing that, and but really, sort of all that I kind of have to say on that one. I have some other thoughts and other things, but this is not my session.
Can I ask a question, Gareth? I mean, I'm not certain you know the answer to this, and maybe Paul might have some insight. But there are. I mean, for water companies, there are social tariffs and things like that. Why don't we see more of those and the take up of social tariffs? Do you know if they're any good? Are they taken up?
That's an interesting one, actually. I've just finished off doing a new e-learning course on other financial help in Wales that's available as part of what we're doing with the Dangos training for frontline workers, which, by the way, I'm very happy to say we just got the second bid for the second round succeeded in. And I've gone through in detail pretty much all of the energy suppliers and water suppliers and so forth schemes. And I have found things that I had no idea existed, because I'm sure they're not deliberately hidden away, but there are complicated schemes applying to small numbers of people in particularly different kind of regional areas. And I think it's a messaging thing, as Paul said, communications, getting people, well, and you said, getting people to know about the existence of help is the necessary first step before they can apply for it. The alternative of giving it help to them automatically is great, but then of course you hit all the problems about, well, if you're going to target, how much information do you need to know about somebody? How invasive of privacy is that level of information going to be if you have precise targeting? And frankly, will it even work? Paul may remember that there was a pilot, again going back 10 years or so, where people claiming housing benefit saw their data being used to assess whether they should also be claiming pension credit, because the information was there to make an entitlement assessment, and paying people pension credit automatically on the basis of the information they provided for HB and council tax. And yet at the end of that, when they had to actually then make an application, having been receiving the money for a while, there was a very high number of people who did not actually make that application. And nobody's quite sure why. Basically, they were giving away money, but it happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky area about doing that kind of identifying people's entitlements automatically. I mean, to a certain extent, we've discussed this, haven't we, Kevin? Using the direct debit take up as a way of identifying people who are entitled to and getting the money to them for the £150.
Well, yes, the direct debit take-up has probably increased as a result of the energy rebate, but so is the number of calls by the government calling it a council tax rebate, because the number of people that have called up saying, why isn't it on my bill, the £150 deduction? So messages can be quite confusing, as we know.
But there is an argument, isn't there? If we come back to what Paul said, Marlena said, and others, one of the advantages of the Get Help system is that helps identify other needs for people when they're coming in and applying for, often they're coming in to apply for one thing, but because the system will check their needs for other things, then local authorities see a take up in other areas of other things, and we could easily add some of those social tariffs into the Get Help as well, which in a way is that direct conversation with the individual rather than necessarily just collecting it and then choosing to do it. So it's there's a lot more discussion to be had, isn't there, about this and using more data to identify. Yeah, okay, so on that basis, I see that we've overrun. It's 12:49. Can I thank Paul, and can we give him an electronic round of applause as well? We can do this. There we go.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. And yes, can I thank everybody else? Can I thank Sophia for coming in and asking questions? I suspect the rest of you were shell-shocked or maybe just depressed on your second bottle of gin this morning. I really know I am.
Just to keep warm.
We couldn't get a word in.
Just to keep warm.
Wise.
Yeah. So I think we'll be back at the same time next week. Gareth, do you want to maybe share some modelling with us if you've got some for next week?
If I have some, I'm trying to run the big model with the final figures at the moment, so I'm not sure what will come out of it, but I'm certainly happy to talk about some of the early conclusions or make something up if that will help. Yeah,
that'll be fine. That'll do. Can I thank you all, and we'll see you all next week. And thank you very much again, Paul, for coming on and depressing us all.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. You got off light. Thank you.
Thanks, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks, Paul.